To OER or not. My name is Dan Abramson. I am the Senior Vice President of Curriculum Instruction for Curriculum Associates, so clearly my bias will show through. We're here today to talk about OER and the differences between OER curriculum, publisher-based curriculum, and how can schools think about how to make the right decisions for their unique needs. We have with us.
I'm Matt Greenfield. I'm one of the two managing partners of Rethink Education, a venture capital firm focused on backing innovative education businesses that serve America's most vulnerable people. I'm a former college English professor. I am one of a small number of venture capitalists. The number is actually larger than one, who has a PhD in English from Yale. But I am the only one who has co-edited a book of essays on the poetry of Edmund Spenser.
It's a hard act to follow. My name is Ken Klau. I'm the Director of Instructional Policy at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education here in Massachusetts. And among the projects that we're working on is something called Curate, Curriculum Ratings by Teachers, where we're really focused on trying to identify what are the sets of core comprehensive curricula that are well aligned to our standards and well suited for our kids. So looking forward to this discussion.
Ken, why don't we start there? When you're helping districts think about the curriculum that they need to solve whatever the unique problems they have what are the criteria you use for choosing curricula, and what are the biggest challenges they face in implementing that curricula? So two big meaty questions to start with.
Okay. I wish nothing like not being thrown a softball to start. So right now, well, until this year, there were no criteria for districts to select curricula, and I think that was part of the problem. We have 404 school districts in Massachusetts. Like many other states, we're a local control state. Those decisions are made independently and autonomously. What we're trying to do is we're not an adoption state. We don't intend to be, nor do we intend to mandate the use of any particular curricula. But what we are trying to do is bring teacher voice into the conversation around what are the characteristics of a good curriculum in terms of not just alignment to our standards, but to what extent does a curriculum serve the learning needs of diverse kids? To what extent does the curriculum accompanied with strong professional development? That the curriculum has sort of an underlying heuristic or instructional design that helps teachers provide great learning experiences for kids. So I think that was the first question. Yeah. What was the second question? Second question, what are the challenges? Sure. So I articulate some of the challenges already. I think that similar to the OER or not OER argument, teachers, we're asking teachers to do a lot. If you look at our more recent educator evaluation criteria, we're asking teachers to not only teach, but also to design lessons, to pull together resources, to create, from soup to nuts. And I think that, with a good core comprehensive curricula, that allows teachers to focus on the pedagogy and the focus on the adaptation and of curricula and other materials for diverse learners. But absent that, teaching, as we all know, many of us know, is something that goes on in autonomy, and it's autonomous, it's isolated, and done independently, and that inherently leads to inequities in what learning experiences students receive. A common comprehensive curricula gives teachers the opportunity to form a common language about what good instruction looks like. It helps guide professional development and resource allocation and support, which I think ultimately is what all teachers look for, is that support that they can receive to be successful.
So I remember going into classrooms and teaching a new course for the first time, and it did seem kind of crazy to me that I would have to make up everything on my own. There are some great anecdotes in The Bee Eater, the biography of Michelle Rhee. She talks about how incredibly hard she and her then boyfriend worked to invent from scratch a set of pedagogical techniques and lesson plans that would work in their respective classrooms. And she started developing tricks and creating manipulables for teaching math. it seems completely crazy that we would ask teachers to do that. So obviously, most of the curriculum adoptions around the country don't come with enough lesson plans and other support materials. Those pedagogical tricks or exercises that really are the hoarded up treasure of the best experienced teachers. I think the whole idea of adoption is incredibly destructive from a business standpoint and an ecosystem standpoint. You have a mad scramble to secure a piece of the pie for the Texas adoption or the California adoption. There was one company that I talked to that had revenue of $42 million in its first year and then $6 million in its second year. I don't know how you run a business like that, but it's also just not healthy from the standpoint of the development of the curriculum. I think the other thing that we need to talk about is that there's a tension between doing what it is that the state is trying to get you to do to prepare students for these summative exams that it's teaching, and what actually works in education. There are clearly things that we are not doing a great job of preparing students to do right now, even in Massachusetts, which is one of the highest performing states in the country with respect to education. All you have to do is look at the conversations about politics in the lead up to the 2016 election to see how poor a job we have done of preparing people for citizenship. Fundamental skills like analyzing arguments and detecting logical fallacies, constructing strong arguments, looking at assertions with even a minimal sort of knowledge of statistics. And perhaps most of all, empathy, the capacity to set aside your emotional responses to something and think about what the other person might be feeling. All of those we need to improve. And so it's not so much a question of which is better, OER or paid curricular materials, but neither is really working right now.
So when you think about that, clearly we have challenges in all 50 states. Massachusetts gets great results, but has their problems they have to solve too. We all agree that a coherent curriculum that allows teachers to really focus on the needs of the children is what we need to put in their hands. Why would you recommend someone go with an OER curriculum in Massachusetts versus trying to find a partner who can bring their resources into the district?
So I think, the whole question to OER or not is almost missing the point in that whether it's a comprehensive curriculum and whether that is delivered digitally or via textbook, or whether you're talking about OER, I think it was David Cohen from University of Michigan who first said that, curriculum is neutral. It sits on a shelf until it's enacted in classrooms. I've worked in the private sector. I worked with an organization that provided very comprehensive curricula, some of which was scripted. The failure there, I think, was teachers were never given the opportunity to look under the hood or feel any sense of ownership over the curriculum. They felt like they're just deliverers of the curriculum of content, even though the instructional design underlying the curriculum was, I think, quite powerful. But teachers were never given permission to own any of that. So I think that even if you're in an environment that is completely about OERs, I think, or I guess the other point I would make is curriculum is neutral until it's enacted in classrooms. Curricula also enacted in schools, which have very particular cultures, different ways of looking at the world, different ways of thinking about accountability. Unless, whether it's the publisher or the professional developer or the person doing the adoption, takes into account those factors and sees implementation as not just training teachers in how to follow directions, but actually helping teachers, giving teachers permission to modify the curriculum as they need to sort of suit the students they have in front of them is really key. And I think, it's not a true dichotomous situation where I think we often, in education, so many things, there's the pendulum that goes from complete autonomy, which we know leads to variability, which we know leads to inequities, to complete consistency. Consistency is a nice word, but consistency is sort of the opposite of innovation at the end of the day. And we want teachers to innovate because learners' needs continually change. And you were saying earlier, Matt, about authentic problem solvings and context. I think that's a weakness of core comprehensive curricula. A lot of times teachers say, look, I'm following the curriculum, I'm really infusing with some good pedagogy too, but content's just not resounding with my students. That's not they can't make connections to their environment, to their prior knowledge, to what this means for them in other contexts, whether it's in the classroom next door or the community outside the school.
Yeah, so I was telling you the anecdote about the two investment bankers who were trying to solve a problem related to the conversion of some notes with different caps on them, and watching them iterate on a spreadsheet for a good half hour before I started really listening to what they were saying. And I don't want to make any grand claims for myself here. The slow, dim realization, oh, this is actually an algebra problem. And once I set it up, it took us about 30 seconds to solve it. And these were both people who had gone to great business schools and achieved very high scores on their GMATs, including the math sections. But there was a failure of FAR transfer. They did not know the procedures in a deep way. They didn't know what the procedures were for quite well enough to recognize when they were needed, with an example in the wild. I would distinguish with respect to OER between two different content domains. In a structured sequential domain like a language or mathematics, or to some extent some of the sciences, you may want a kind of monolithic interactive product that is developed by a single entity. It's hard for a nonprofit to invest the kind of capital required to do that in a really effective way. It can take north of 10 million to develop something like that in certain domains. On the other hand, there are disciplines like, say, history or literature, where the right strategy is the one that you named earlier, the name of your organization, to curate, right? And so for history, the foundation may be lesson plans and the curation of a collection of original historical documents that the students engage. And I think that OER is much better set up to address that kind of curricular challenge than the ones in core math, those interactive products. And it's going to get harder and more expensive when we get ubiquitous AR and VR headsets. Developing that content is going to be even more expensive.
When you think about curation, one research paper that I've been reading a lot is The Opportunity Myth by Tntp, and 56% of teachers don't think their students can meaningfully engage with grade level text, and so they're going out and they're curating, and the materials they're finding, I can't remember all the numbers, but 8 out of 10 times they're giving them materials that are many levels below grade level. Are teachers prepared to tackle the curation problem at scale?
Absolutely not. I mean, the burden should not be pushed out to the individual teacher. Not that you have to dictate what they do, not that you should dictate what they do, but you need to equip them with a complete toolkit. I should say I'm a small investor in Better Lesson. I think they created a pretty incredible resource just by virtue of having scope and sequence so that the learning objects could be slotted into the right place. A lot of the previous repositories of learning objects had been just useless because it was hard to find the right thing. YouTube continues to be a wild chaos containing good resources that YouTube does not serve up to in a sequenced way. Yeah, we need centralized curators, and we need curation engines. I backed one company that did that. It's now owned by Macmillan, but those solutions are not being used at scale.
Any examples you're seeing?
I mean, I've been in schools where, so the majority of schools I've visited have on paper a comprehensive core curriculum, but it varies considerably, let alone between schools, but within schools, and the extent to which those curricula are being used. And that decision whether to use or not use or to modify is really driven by sort of individual decisions teachers are making about the suitability of the materials for the students they have. You mentioned the opportunity myth. That's something that we're investigating, the idea of sort of doing mini opportunity myth studies in our own state. I was in a meeting the other day where our commissioner quoted Richard Elmore, and he said, "Task drives performance." I walk through classrooms and I see student work on the walls, and someone once asked me, "What does this tell you about the rigor with which students are able to engage with the material?" And I says, "It tells me very little. I want to know what the assignment was." And so a strong curriculum, among other features, you were asking earlier, what are sort of the criteria that we're trying to work with on teachers, and that's, grade appropriateness for sure. I think that many classrooms, students are engaging with material that fall below the grade level that they're at. And, when we talk about the traditional structure of schooling and personalized learning and the fact that kids not being given the opportunity to accelerate, I may be well-skilled or gifted in one area, but maybe not in another area. That could be between subjects. That could be within a subject in a given year. And the current structure, I think, constrains kids from the opportunity to engage with increasingly more challenging curricula that may be above grade level. And the current structure of schooling, I think, is very grade-based, very age-based, and very, very fixed in a lot of ways.
I think you can actually take a group of students who have different levels of understanding and deploy them in a team and have them all learn. And the one who is maybe on the cutting edge, who has the most advanced knowledge of the subject, will benefit from explaining things. But even that student in a group will go farther than he or she would alone. But how many of you have been teachers or professors? Okay, almost everyone in the room. You probably have some really magical tricks that will result in a good classroom experience almost every time. Is there anyone who has been a teacher who does not have at least one trick of that kind? No. Okay, so you all know what I'm talking about. So you developed it. Maybe you share it with other people in your school. Maybe within a charter network, you even get to go to a joint curricular meeting. Maybe you happen to become a curricular official. But how does that great technique that you discovered get to other people, right? Where is the discovery mechanism for that trick? And I would argue that those tricks, those exercises, those are far more important than any sort of content reading that the students will do. This is how you make those things come alive. And there's no good way of sharing them. And what we need beyond the ability to share them, teachers pay teachers, right? I hate the idea of teachers paying for it. Like, why the hell should teachers pay for it? But also, it's just a limited set of people. The key thing that is missing from that is the ability to do what open source software people call forking, right? So you see someone else's fantastic trick for making the American Revolution really come alive. But you think, here are two ways that we could improve that exercise. How does knowledge of that get back to the original and circulate throughout the entire network of nodes of people who are currently using that trick. There's no way to do that today. So that's the kind of repository and curation and categorization that we need. And it doesn't exist right now. Better Lesson and to some extent, I guess Learn Zillion are about as close as we get.
So when we think about OER, one of the allures is free. But, at Curriculum Associates, we often, we go up against, we compete against Eureka Math, and we believe, if you look at third-party resources, our program has the coherence, it has the usability, it really meets all of the criteria of a great K-8 math program, and we have to compete against free. And one of the things that generally turns out to be true is there's no such thing as free. We call it free like a puppy. So I'm curious if you have any, background or information on districts that have made it work with limited cost, or if, like the opportunity myth, there's the myth of free in OER. You have one right in front of you.
So, depending on what the OER is, one I think nice thing about digital tools and digital curricula is that to some extent you can look at the extent to which they're being utilized over a text-based curricula. So you can actually see in real time whether something you've invested in, if it is for cost, is actually being utilized and under what conditions it's successful or not successful. I think it goes back to what I said earlier, which is it's ultimately, I would pay, if I were a superintendent, I would pay a lot of money for something that I thought was really successful, just like I would pay nothing for something that's really successful if that was the option. It's really the extent to which teachers understand and can build off of, do the forking, as you mentioned, but also for there to be ways within a school, within a school culture for teachers to be able to share that. So if it's a free resource and it's something that can be assimilated into that culture, it's something that teachers can get behind and really understand and know how to use and have opportunities to share what it looks like in action with particular groups of kids or in particular contexts. That's as powerful as something, it's of incredible value. Something that's really expensive is the bright, shiny toy. If it's not used well, if it's not even utilized or not even utilized under the right conditions, it's really a wasted effort. So the quote we sometimes use at the department is, what is the academic return on investment? So it's less of a cost proposition than it is sort of a learning proposition.
Yeah, there certainly is a lot of uninspiring content out there, both OER and paid. If you just ask the question, this is my question when looking at content. Most venture capitalists won't touch anything that is content-like anymore. They think that the value of content is going to zero because of OER. I think they're looking at other domains like software. So open source software runs the web. Why can't we do that? Why can't we build something like Apache or Git or whatever within education? One reason is that in open source software, there are a lot of companies like Oracle and Microsoft pouring literally billions of dollars a year of programmer time into building and augmenting those systems. And we don't have that. It's very hard to keep an open source free curricular resource from just gradually decaying, right? From not being updated. There isn't a sort of systematic and comprehensive procedure for getting community engaged in. What we need is something more like GitHub, basically, is what I'm saying. Something that everyone has access to, and you can see which resources have been pulled more times by people and maybe see what the utilization of the software is. And you can fork it and create your own version anytime you want to. That doesn't really exist. I mean, beyond that, I think some sort of, when I say curation engine, what we want is something that understands semantically and in terms of taxonomies and concept maps where something fits. just relying on people to tag things themselves is insufficient. So we need that infrastructure. I think that ultimately, for many disciplines, not necessarily for math, the vision is you're going to have a Darwinian constant struggle of content items. Someone will produce something great, it'll get wide adoption, and then someone, maybe even a 7th grader, will see it and say, wouldn't it be fun if you involved giraffes in this? And then that would catch on, and the new version would replace the older version. And you'd be able to measure the usage and also the efficacy on some level in the classrooms. You'd have a feedback loop. We're pretty far from having that right now in K-12 or in higher ed.
One of the more interesting announcements out of the OER world came out the other day, where Illustrative Math agreed to have their program distributed by McGraw-Hill. So a partnership between an OER curriculum provider and a publisher. I think Illustrative Math's a great program. I have a lot of respect for what they're doing. Why do you think they felt the need to partner with the publishers and kind of move away from the free model that set up their establishment to begin with?
Can I turn that question around on you? Why do you think?
Why do I think? So why do I think? I think because distribution's really hard, and the procurement process, often equity folks really want to get excited about getting involved in education. And I don't want to be offensive, but sometimes it feels like it's the goose that laid the golden egg. There are a lot of dollars out there. They're available to people, but they are really hard to get access to because, one, the adoption process is broken, and two, even in open territory non-adoption states, it's a relationship-driven sale. It takes people feet on the ground, helping you understand the coherence of your program, the instructional design of your program. If you're going to get good results out of the program, you need to understand why it was built the way it was built, or it is neutral and it is a bunch of pages sitting on a shelf. Without that understanding, which comes from large groups of people really digging into the research on human learning, on what motivates children, on what teachers need to understand, without that network, it's really hard to get that material into the hands of educators in a way that it gets used as we intended it to be designed. So on the one hand, I'm really impressed with, the decision Lisa made to do that. On the other hand, I was talking to her about thinking, hey, maybe we should be that person to do that. We happen to not have the reach into 9th through 12th grade where they really wanted to focus, so we weren't the right partner. But that distribution and procurement is really hard to break through, and Amazon says they're going to do it, and it doesn't change. It's a slow-moving market. So curious from your perspective as an investor looking to help organizations get out there, how do you think about that process?
So there definitely are a lot of busted K-12 companies. It can be pretty hard to build one. But a lot of people talk about school districts being difficult, irrational, and slow. But Larry Berger of Amplify is hilarious on that point. You should hear his Kazakhstan visitor story sometime. The punchline is the Kazakhstan, a visitor from the Ministry of Education in Kazakhstan is going around and visiting some U.S. districts with him and seeing his tools in operation, saying, this procurement process seems very inefficient and corrupt. But the actual numbers for a business like yours or like Renaissance Learning, or we have one that just hit 1.4 million in revenue last year that was bootstrapped up to 550K with one full-time employee. If you get product market fit right, the actual software as a service business metrics, the financial metrics for a healthy software business can be fantastic. We are seeing that the customer acquisition cost, the cost of selling is low relative to the cost of selling to a college or a business. And if that sounds counterintuitive relative to what I was saying about the long, unpredictable, and somewhat irrational sales cycle, it's because it can be long, unpredictable, and irrational and still not rely on a huge number of touch points, right? So it's not necessarily expensive. So if you look at a publicly traded software as a service business, most of them you will see have a customer acquisition cost that is well over a year's worth of revenue. That's why many of them are still losing money at scale, even as public companies. So it's a year and a half before they have recouped the customer acquisition cost in many cases. For K-12 companies that are healthy, it's more like 6 months. So I don't know what your EBITDA margins are, but I know that Renaissance's are something like 50%. Same with, it's not just a K-12 company, but the same with a number of the other large PE-owned platforms. Very healthy EBITDA margins. And even the faster growing younger companies can have positive cash flow margins. We've seen a number of bootstrap companies. Our company, Flocabulary, was bootstrapped up to $5 million in revenue before we invested. So it can be hard to build distribution, but I think a lot of the problems that entrepreneurs and venture-backed companies have had are ultimately the result of a failure of knowledge and empathy. They didn't know what a school district was. They didn't know how a school district conceptualized its needs. And so they're a bit like the dog that may be a very appealing, cute dog, but is wrong in its perception that the thing you want most in the world is to have the dog straddling your leg. It's annoying, right? It's not the thing you need from the dog at that particular moment. A lot of K-12 software vendors and higher ed software vendors are like that, right? The people who start it, they don't have a chief empathy officer. That's what I call that person.
So I know that the relationship between vendors and districts can be, certainly can be a difficult one, and there's certainly concern around the motivations and all of that. But I've gotten to know a lot of folks in very small, startup phase ed tech companies who many of them were educators actually, and do have, and in fact they went into they left education because there were very particular problems they faced as teachers that they wanted to solve. The challenge then, though, becomes...
How many of them were administrators as opposed to teachers?
That's a good question. I don't know. I tend to empathize with the teachers because I was one. But I think they find that and I think ideally they would want to operate as a nonprofit, but that's just not viable without capital. But I want to get into one other piece about OER, and you were asking about the merger earlier. I'm not sure whether this factored into it or not. Is that, and then Matt, you were talking about just the constant proliferation of OERs. I think there's a real concern that's not discussed often enough about accessibility for kids with disabilities. There's the teacher who creates their own classroom website, and they're serving up images, here's a Rembrandt, here's a Monet, let's really look at this. And there are kids who maybe are sight impaired or have other disabilities accessing the material. And there was a case in Massachusetts of a district that, a group of concerned parents got together and said, you're putting out material that's not accessible to everyone in the community. And as a result, you're denying kids access, to public education. I know that sounds kind of overblown, but this district had to take a lot of corrective action to get back into compliance. And I think that, we don't want to risk, we at the same, while we want to embrace the fact that OER is continually evolving and continually multiplying, I think we need to be careful that we're not leaving vulnerable kids behind because they can't access the materials. And I know a lot of OERs are now built so-called UDL enabled or UDL ready, but I think that a big consideration needs to be made into how kids access, interact, and consume these materials.
Yeah, and there are also language differences and cultural differences too. So I think cultural relevance for kids in different parts of the country is something that OER has done a lousy job of addressing. And then there's a higher level of what I call a deep personalization. Shallow personalization is you at least understand that you're teaching at grade level, you're teaching how to graph a linear equation, but this particular child does not understand negative numbers, right? She's been sitting there in the back of the classroom and people have been talking gibberish for years and nobody has gone to the trouble of recognizing where her problem lies. They just give her bad grades. So that is the minimum. We need to be able to do that. And for that, we need interactive software and adaptive evaluation mechanisms. And we need the capacity to remediate, to be willing to say, okay, we're teaching graphing linear equations here, but we're going to teach you how negative numbers work. We need to do that. But then deep personalization is when you start asking other questions like, what is this student passionate about? What is this student afraid of? What sort of traumas has this student experienced? It's a question we ask way too infrequently, and it can shape your educational pathway. Okay, this child is interested in music. This other one is most interested in sports. Or at an earlier age, maybe this one wants to be a fire person or a member of the police force. Whatever it is that child is interested in and passionate about and somewhat knowledgeable about, they're all knowledgeable about something, you need to go with that, right? You need readings for the child who is passionate about music that are music inflected, right? So if you're teaching an American history course, you need a slightly different set of readings for each student. You need readings that are, if an American history course in sort of the Whiggish version is the story of the expansion of the rights of citizens to new groups, each of those expansions, I realize that sounds like a rather optimistic interpretation of American history at the current moment, but each of those expansions of rights is associated with certain musical genres, whether it's disco and Stonewall or spirituals and slavery, right? So how do you create that customized version of the course for the student who's passionate about music? How do you incorporate materials about the possible careers for someone who loves music, not just being a star musician, but being a music journalist, being a sound engineer? And how do you show the pathway to those jobs, right? What are the things you need to learn in order to be a sound engineer? Oh, one of the things you need to learn is fractions, right? So instead of fractions being a random torture inflicted by adults with a lot of talk of pizzas and pies, you actually are teaching them something that they need in order to make progress towards what at that moment is one of their possible career goals, right? How do you do that? Now, I think that curation of some OER is definitely going to be a part of that, but we need the curation mechanism. I also think that some of it is going to have to be done by very expensive monolithic systems.
It's a complicated problem to solve, and even when we were talking about accessibility, talking about student choice, student interest, when you want to build those bodies of content to have available to children and align to the state standards and the state and all of the criteria the states have, it's tricky work. It takes a long time. It takes incredibly skilled and talented people, and that's not to say that that isn't happening out of the OER community, but to your point, there isn't an open and shared place where that can evolve as a GitHub of great curriculum. So that's an interesting idea.
Maybe it's GitHub.
Maybe it's GitHub. I think the real difference though is, poorly structured code won't work. A teacher can teach a poorly structured lesson and not know it was poorly structured till after they took 45 minutes of a child's time. Whereas with engineering, I think the results you see a little bit more quickly than the long tail on instructional implications.
I think there's so many things that are unpredictable about software too. People are building all sorts of solutions to the same problem. No, I think the idea that you can't do anything experimental because you'd be wasting the time of the child is deeply misguided, because we are just not getting the job done right now, right? They're memorizing facts and mastering processes in a sort of controlled environment so that they're able to more or less succeed on the state summative exams. But there are certain things that are very fundamental that they are not acquiring. I think that if you do something project-based and collaborative and educationally authentic, you can probably do a better job of teaching towards the state standards and the end-of-year exams, and also do some 21st century learning. There are a lot of books that tell optimistic stories about collaborative, project-based learning. Not so many that talk about how you actually implement them at scale in districts and what the administrative challenges are, but it's certainly possible.
All right, we're at 5 minutes, and we did want to take some questions from the audience. I think one thing we all agree on is the question to OER is not the right question. Really what we're all trying to do is put the best tools and resources in the hands of educators. That could come from a published company, that could come from a Curriculum Associates, a Houghton Mifflin, a Pearson. Any number of different places have great tools to access for teachers. But the key thing is to ensure that that access is access for all kids, that it's culturally responsive, and that it's meeting the needs of both the educators and the teachers in a way that's both empathetic of their individual challenges and also measurable, so that you can start to adapt whatever it is you're doing in a way that it evolves and changes to meet the needs of those kids in your class. And whether it's OER or a published material isn't really the right question. It's how you're getting the results you're looking for and what are the tools you're putting in front of teachers. So love to hear from the audience to see if they have any questions.
Thank you. Yeah, curriculum vehicle change, I'm actually skeptical, and I think maybe the question that I'm interested in hearing you talk about is product versus service. Is there too much emphasis on the product and not enough about helping the teachers really understand how to integrate and effectively use whatever the curriculum product is and wherever it's coming from? Is that balance between product and service wrong?
I think you've just thrown them into the briar patch.
Well, no, I think you've just given me a softball. What I would say is, yes, I agree with you. The greatest product in the world in the absence of service will sit on that shelf and not get the result or be used in the way it was intended. I'll pitch a little bit here. At Curriculum Associates, 50% of our staff roughly is in the field service. So they're the folks who are out there helping people understand how to use those materials. Previous company I came from, I worked on Read 180. Read 180 got great results when it was used in a certain way. If we sold it to the customer and they didn't implement it in the way we intended to be implemented, they came back frustrated they didn't get the results. 10 times out of 10, we went back and looked at how they were using it and said, oh, you know, you didn't contribute, you didn't participate in the professional development. You didn't get to the point where you understood the thinking behind what we're doing, that it's about building background knowledge for students. So I think products in the absence of great service and partnerships, where it's not sell the product, put it in the school, and expect great things to happen. It's a lot of work to get those great things to happen. It's about behavioral change. It's about changing the way you think about the content and the instruction, and that takes time, and you have to measure your growth patiently, because it takes teachers a couple years to get really familiar with a new way of teaching. And they're not going to get familiar with it unless you're helping them in that process along the way. So my bias is clearly bleeding through here. So if someone has a counterpoint.
No, and I put my money where my mouth is with education elements, which also helps with change management and transition to new curricular models.
Yeah, I think there's that sort of the sense of service sort of being like this one-way, one-time transfer of knowledge or information. And I think, you know, just like schools are learning organizations for kids, they need to be learning organizations for adults. And no matter how powerful or effective a curriculum is, educators need time to learn how to use it to assimilate. You know, educators, just like kids aren't empty vessels waiting to be filled up with information, neither are educators. They approach the work with very particular beliefs, experiences, feelings of success, feelings of failure with that child they couldn't reach, and so they need time to engage with the curriculum. And I think this, you know, the ownership piece is really important. So there are assessments that you can give for, I'll use assessment as a quick analogy. There's assessments that you give where the teacher teaches for the whole year, and the student sits down and takes the test, and a few months later, maybe even better, a few weeks later, the results come back. There's not a lot the teacher can do with that data. Maybe they can use that, you know, to think about forward to their practice for the following year. But for those kids that moved on, and we know that, and we know that's a limitation. There are other assessments that are more sort of, but the accountability piece there, I think, is that the teachers sort of felt like they've done all they can, and I'll try harder with the next group of kids. Then there are assessments where kids are producing, you know, real authentic work products continuously and along the way, such that at the end of the year, there's a body of work that that student owns. And I think from an accountability standpoint, that teacher owns as well. I mean, if I don't do well on a one-time test at the end of the year, it could be for a whole variety of reasons. Maybe I didn't get enough sleep that night. Maybe I was in a bad mood the day I took the test. But at the end of the year, I don't have a body of work supporting what I learned in school. That's not just all on me. That's on the adults in the room too. So I think that, you know, looking at curriculum ultimately as a tool that helps students learn, but also helps adults learn how to better support students.
Yeah, we need to do away with grades and also do away with summative exams. What we need is to continually monitor what students know and make that an invisible part of the daily fabric of instruction.
Do we have time for one more? No? Okay, so just to sum up what you said, you don't lose weight by